who should we be thinking of is the earliest audience of the Book of Jonah? Obviously, as Christians, we read it in the canon, and we want to do that. But it's also helpful to think through who's this book written to, or with in mind.
Yeah. Well, the, unlike the epistles, we don't get the addressees in
Mhm.
Jonah, so we kind of have to approach it inductively. So if it's written in Hebrew, um, if and it, there's no there need to be really tight chronology from, let's assume, the prophet Jonah, who's in probably the ninth century, and the events that happened, the writing of the book rather. Um, it could be, I'd say, in terms of the language, the Hebrew that's used is kind of classical Hebrew, so it's pre-exilic, but that's a 200-year span, more or less. So
Mhm.
from Jonah on down to almost exile. For me, the only question that would be directly affected by that would be whether Jonah could have written could have been written to his northern audience, assuming he comes from the north, as well as the south, which went into exile later, or if the book is a little later, the North may already be in exile, and he's
Mhm.
there writing primarily for a Southern audience. Uh, Either way, so yeah, either way, because book is a certain message. Either he thinks people everywhere, the 12 tribes, or the remaining two tribes.
Mhm.
Um, some of them, at least, seem to have a problem thinking accurately about their status, their position vis-a-vis the other nations. That's
Mhm.
what I would say is common, regardless of the eighth, seventh
Mhm.
century Northern Kingdom and Southern, or just the Southern. Um, he's writing clearly to an Israelite audience that has takes certain things for granted, has a certain understanding of its place in the world and its place vis-a-vis other nations. So slightly more precise answer to the question would be he's writing to people with that kind of predilection, that kind of prejudice, if you will, in one or both of the Israelite territories, northern and southern kingdoms.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, because I often think of, Second Kings 17, which is this, laundry list of the problems that Israel has committed that have led to their destruction at the hands of Assyria. And tucked in there are a couple of verses that says, "Hey Judah, you're doing the same thing." You know, and then obviously we could go to different sections in the prophetic literature where it's talking about the sins of the northern kingdom, and then it just says, "And the southern kingdom did the worst." So there's some sense in what you're saying, since we can't narrow down as precisely as we can with the New Testament, that even if we hear this as to the 12 tribes or to the 10 tribes in the north, by its adoption into the canon, at some point we are also hearing it as Judah, because we know in some sense, canonically speaking, and historically God, and the prophets use that repeatedly as a warning. So I think that's a helpful way to think about that, to see that these two are, um, even if we could parse them out, I'm not sure that we necessarily have to in order to understand the message.
The only other thought that comes to mind on that point would be both, either separately or both together, would be aware of what you said, Assyria. It's like
Okay.
the meter goes up. They're all going to respond, I think it's fair to say, negatively. They
Yeah.
may have more or less indirect or direct contact with Assyria, geographically and so on. But there would, I think, again, across the two kingdoms, be a certain distrust at a minimum,
Mhm.
if not just downright disgust or fear when you mentioned this massive military behemoth to the northwest. So that would be another commonality between the two audiences. But yes, it does. We
Yeah.
don't. We're not stuck with the kind of South Galatians, North Galatians problem
Yeah.
that you get in the New Testament. This is just Jonah to Israelites, wherever they may be,
Yeah.
for the reasons that the book makes clear.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's beautiful. I so often think that, um, we began this conversation talking about moral example of Jonah and biblical characters, and how that isn't always the best way to read the Old Testament or the Bible, outside of Jesus. Um, I often think that many of the characters are more like a question to the reader. you know, well, what kind of person are you going to be? I actually think this way about the end of Second Kings, where the king is in captivity in Babylon and has his food all the rest of his days, and it's like, is there hope here or not? You know,
Mhm.
and what's going to happen? So I think so much of the Old Testament, in many ways, is a question to the reader. What, how will you respond if you were to put yourself in those shoes? And so the idea that Jonah, in the end, still has a decision to make, I think,
Yeah.
is a really interesting thing.